Okay, so our speaker today is Starr Nolan, one of our regular speakers, who has been studying the Dharma since she met Sujata Yasa at Anattasati Magga. Her special areas of focus and study include the Heart Sutra and the Lojong Slogans, especially Norman Fisher's Training in Compassion and Zen Teachings on the Practice of Lojong. She is the executive director for Casting Carolinas, a nonprofit that provides free retreats for women living life after cancer. Welcome, Starr.
Thank you. Yes, thank you once again for the opportunity to share our Anattasati Magga's daily recitation. And the classes that are based on this are called the Word of the Buddha. So essentially, the Word of the Buddha is all things Buddhist. So we use our mala, which is different from a traditional mala. It has only 58 large beads rather than the traditional 108 beads. And at the end is our key, the Anattasati Magga key. So we use our mala then to remind us of our daily recitation. So we are, I think we're at the very last teaching on this. And so we did not go in order, which is great, actually perfect, isn't it? We didn't go in order. We are now then to, though, our class number 3. So the Word of the Buddha is divided into 8 classes. Again, the daily recitation intended to be done daily to remind us. And these are all real condensed teachings on the Dharma, very, very condensed. So I want to give blessings of love and respect to Sujata Yasa. We're so glad that she is finally back with us and will be teaching again after she's been through a really serious round of cancer treatment. She's going to be back with us. So blessings to Sujata Yasa. She created these, or she wrote these. You can create them. She wrote her commentary on this. And when we enter lay minister training, and the first teachings that we are given to offer are these. And our instruction when we first start is that we are to just read what's written, what she has written. So these are repeated in order to reach teacher ordination, lay minister full ordination, and then teacher ordination. We go through these many, many, many times. So they are repeated. And as we move along the path, then we are given the freedom to bring in other teachings. So that's what I will be doing today, is I will give you what Sujata has written, and then I will bring in a few other teachers that I think present this in a way that is clear and simple. So today, then, the teachings are our 11th bead. All formations are transient, anicca. Our 12th bead is all assembled things are without an independent, are subject to distress and suffering. All assembled things. We've rewritten this, and that's why it's hard to go back and read it. We've rewritten it, and now it's all assembled things are subject to distress and suffering, dukkha, and all compounded things are without an independent and permanent self, anatta. So the 3 characteristics of existence. I was really laughing when I was trying to put this teaching together, and as you were reading, my initial study, the one I spent many years on, was Heart Sutra, and being me, I read everything I could read, and there are many, many books on the Heart Sutra, many teachings on the Heart Sutra, lots of words about the Heart Sutra. Um, and of course, you know, the almost big joke is that you can't understand that in words. um, it's an experiential teaching. And I think these are the same, is that there are many words that have been written about the three characteristics of existence, chapters in books and lots of words. But what we also want to remember is how we deeply understand. What is a deep knowing of these teachings? It's funny, you know, when I was getting ready to do this also, I had all my stuff out and I was like, okay, well, I've got this and this and this, and I've got my book here, and I want to make sure I've got it all in order. And so this morning, what I usually do before I teach is I get up and just sort of go over it yet again. And so my cat, who's extremely wise, a great teacher, she came into the room as I picked up my book to go over it, and she threw up right at my feet. And I was like, thank you. Okay. So, yeah, and she makes all these noises when she does that, right? So then I had the opportunity to go to, all right, three characteristics of existence right here in front of me. You know, here she, you know, her morning meal did not stay with her. She immediately went outside, came right back in, and was like, "Hey, I'm good." Right? The cat that was there was not the cat that came back in. And then I, of course, suffered because I felt guilty that I had given the cat something that upset her stomach. Right? So, you know, there's dukkha. Um, so I was just sort of laughing and thinking, well, my cat really kind of is a great teacher here, maybe better than I can teach it. So gratitude to my cat Jasmine for her morning teaching. So here's what Sujata has to say then as her teaching on all formations are transient. But first, actually, she goes into the title, the universal characteristics of existence. These are sometimes also called marks of existence, Dharma seals. So they're referred to in different ways with different language. But what she chooses to do in her introduction is to define the terms, which is such a Buddhist thing, right? We need to know what is a characteristic of existence. And at first, when I was going through this, I thought, well, that's just overboard. Why do we need to know what a characteristic is? But as I have read this many times, thought about it many times, it truly is part of the understanding, the deep understanding. What is a characteristic? So here is Sujata's commentary. There are three universal characteristics of existence which you and I and every one of us are subject to, and there is no escape from them. This is an important aspect of the teachings of the Buddha. Like the Four Noble Truths, karma, dependent origination, and the five aggregates, the three characteristics of the teachings of the Buddha are part of what we might call the doctrinal contents of wisdom. In other words, when we talk about the knowledge and the understanding that is implied by wisdom, we have this teaching in mind. Before we examine the characteristics individually, and you know, we can do this even though what we discover eventually is they are not individual characteristics, no separation. Before we examine the characteristics individually, let us come to an understanding of what they mean and what way they are useful. So first, what is a characteristic and what is not? A characteristic is something which is necessarily connected with something else. Because the characteristic is necessarily connected, it can tell us about the nature of the thing. So it is necessarily connected with something, and therefore tells us about the nature of that thing that it is connected with. So here's her example. Heat is a characteristic of fire. Heat of the fire is always and invariably connected with fire. On the other hand, the heat of water depends on external factors. A stove, the heat of the sun, etc. But the heat of fire is natural to fire. It is in this sense that the Buddha uses the term characteristic to refer to facts of nature of existence that are always connected with existence and that are always found in existence. The characteristic heat is always connected with fire. So we can understand something about the nature of fire from heat. We can understand that fire is hot. We can understand that we can use fire to cook our food, to warm ourselves. The characteristic of heat tells us something about fire, how to use it, and what to do with it. If we tried to think of the characteristic of heat as connected with water, it wouldn't help us to use water, because heat is not always connected with water. We can't cook our food with water. We can't warm ourselves with water. So when the Buddha said there are three characteristics of existence, he meant that these characteristics are always present in existence and that they help us to understand what to do with existence. So that's the intro. That's the intro to this teaching from Sujata. And then somewhere, because I know I put it somewhere, I was going to share with you. Again, my cat was totally right. She's like, like, just get rid of that stuff and just read what's in front of you. 1 second here. When you think you have things in order, think again, right? I don't know. I think my cat may have stolen that that part of what I was going to read. At any rate, I was going to read a little bit of Pema Chodron to you all, but I'll just go right along with Sujata's teaching, which is what this is sort of directing me to do, I guess. No, Pema just showed up. So here's what Pema actually had to say. The Buddha taught that there are three principal characteristics of existence, and Pema calls these marks, the marks of existence, or the three facts of life. So the three principal characteristics: impermanence, and she calls no self egolessness. And I like that, because when you say no self, you think it's almost like you've made a category or a separation. Egolessness, impermanence, and suffering or dissatisfaction. And Pema says, the lives of all beings are marked by these three qualities. Recognizing these to be real and true in our own experience helps us to relax with things as they are. Nothing is static or fixed. All is fleeting and impermanent, and that is the ordinary state of affairs. Everything is in process. Everything, every tree, every blade of grass, all the animals, insects, human beings, buildings, the animate and the inanimate, is always changing, moment to moment. It means that life isn't always going to go our way. It means that there is loss as well as gain, and we don't like that. So that's from Pema's book, The Places That Scare You, which is interesting in itself. So the first characteristic, anicca, the characteristic of impermanence. The fact of impermanence, it's interesting it's call it a fact, has been recognized not only in Buddhist thought, but also elsewhere in the history of philosophy. It was the ancient Greek philosopher Heraclitus who remarked that one could not step into the same river twice. This remark, which implies the ever-changing and transient nature of things, is a very Buddhist remark. In the Buddhist scriptures, it is said that the three worlds are impermanent like autumn clouds, that birth and death are like a dance, and that human life is like a flash of lightning or a waterfall. All these are compelling images of impermanence, and they help us to understand that all things are marked or characterized by impermanence. Again, these categories are not separate. So even as there are teachings that attempt to separate them, we see that they are completely interconnected. So the teaching goes on, and again on anicca. If we look at our own personality, we will find that our bodies are impermanent. Right, this one is not a tough one to actually understand. And, we tend to be able to understand impermanence on that level. Right, so the relative and the absolute. On the relative level, yeah, we know, right? We see that things fall apart. We see, what the cat's teaching us. So I'd like to also add in here some commentary from Norman Fisher, because for some reason Norman Fisher resonates for me, the way he's able to language things that truly we really understand more deeply without the language. So here's what Norman Fisher says, and this is from his book, When You Greet Me, I Bow, Notes and Reflections from a Life in Zen. And there's a chapter in this book called Impermanence is Buddha Nature. So part of the reason I like to bring in Norman Fisher's teaching is because he does give us a Zen perspective. And Impermanence is Buddha Nature, the title of this chapter, is actually a quote from Dogen. So I'll give you a little bit of what Norman Fisher has to say about impermanence and Buddha nature. Practitioners have always understood impermanence as the cornerstone of Buddhist teachings and practice. So again, that's a different statement. The cornerstone of Buddhist teachings and practice. All that exists is impermanent. Nothing lasts. Nothing can be grasped or held onto. And when we don't fully appreciate this simple but profound truth, we suffer. When we do understand or appreciate it, we have peace and understanding. So again, when Mahayana practice came along, and this was a long time after the passing of the Buddha, a fourth characteristic was sometimes added to the three. So the fourth characteristic being this peace or nirvana as a characteristic. As far as classical Buddhism is concerned, impermanence is the number one inescapable and essentially painful fact of life. It is the singular existential problem that the whole edifice of Buddhist practice is meant to address. To understand impermanence at the deepest possible level, and again, this is what I was going for with Norman Fisher. He says we all can understand it at superficial levels. We see that things fall apart. We see ourselves changing, everything around us. And we certainly had a huge lesson in this in October here in Western North Carolina, as we watched the hurricane teach us about impermanence. So to understand impermanence at the deepest possible level and to merge with it fully is the whole of the Buddhist path. So again, he's talking about the absolute experience of impermanence, right? That we're the relative and the absolute. The Buddha's final words express this. Impermanence is inescapable. Everything vanishes. Therefore, nothing is more important than continuing the path with diligence. So I will continue with a little bit of Norman Fisher's commentary. He does have quite a bit to say about impermanence as Buddha nature. All conditioned things have the nature of vanishing, the Buddha said. What is impermanence after all? So again, he goes on to say, when we're young, we know that death is coming, and we can put it off. It'll probably come later. So maybe we don't have to be so concerned with it now. And he says, even if we're concerned with it early in life, maybe that concern is more philosophical. But as we age, we know death is coming sooner rather than later. So we take it more personally, but do we really know what we're talking about? Death may be the ultimate loss, the ultimate impermanence. But even on a lesser everyday scale, impermanence and the loss it entails still happens more or less later. Something is here now in a particular way, later it will not be. I am or have something now, later I will not. But, and this is why I really appreciate Norman Fisher's, he says, but later is the safest of all time frames. It can be safely ignored because it's not now. It's later, and later never comes. And even if it does, we don't have to worry about it now. We can worry about it later. For most of us, most of the time, impermanence seems irrelevant. I think that really is a point that I had never really pondered or considered, right? You have this sort of built-in idea about later and how that feels safer. But in truth, impermanence isn't later, it's now. The Buddha said, all conditioned things have the nature of vanishing. Right now, as they appear before us, they have that nature. Right now. It's not that something vanishes later. Right now, everything is in some way, though we don't understand in what way, vanishing before our very eyes. Impermanence is not only loss, it is change. And this is another point that Norman Fisher makes that I don't see often. Impermanence is not only loss, it's change, and change can be refreshing and renewing. In fact, change is always both good and bad, because change, even when it is refreshing, always entails loss. Nothing new appears unless something old ceases. Goes on then to tell us about Dogen's writing. And you know, in Norman Fisher's book on the Lojong, which I think I heard you refer to in the intro, he explains that his interest in writing this book on Lojong, in part, was because as he looks at Zen teachings, he sees that there really aren't any specific teachings on compassion, that those are lacking. So he feels like pulling in these different understandings and teachings are really important. So then in his chapter here, he quotes Dogen, and again, if you know Dogen, the way he communicates the Dharma, I think is just an amazing experience in itself. So Norman Fisher says that here's a quote from Dogen: "Impermanence is itself Buddha nature." For Dogen, impermanence isn't a problem to be overcome with diligent effort on the path. Impermanence is the path. Practice isn't the way to cope with or overcome impermanence. It is the way to fully appreciate and live it. If you want to understand Buddha nature, Dogen writes, you should intimately observe cause and effect over time. When the time is ripe, Buddha nature manifests. So, in explaining this teaching, Dogen, in his usual, and this is Norman Fisher, in his usual inside out, upside down way, writes that practice isn't so much a matter of changing or improving the conditions of your inner or outer life as a way of fully embracing and appreciating those conditions, especially the condition of impermanence and loss. When you practice, the time becomes ripe. So again, this is a point that I've seen Norman Fisher make over and over again, and it definitely resonates for me, and that helps me let go of later and some of the many ways that I notice myself resisting impermanence. He says, present time is ungraspable. As soon as it occurs, it immediately falls into the past. As soon as I am here, I am gone. If this were not so, how could the me of this moment ever give way to the me of the following moment? Unless the first me disappears, clearing the way, the second me cannot appear. So my being here is thanks to my not being here. If I were not here, If I were not here, I couldn't be here. That's it. So that's a little bit of Norman Fisher's commentary on this. And again, I love that. If I were not here, I couldn't be here. Okay, so sure. So that's the first characteristic of existence. And let me see. As Sujata loves to talk about and write about our own internal self structure, personality. So she goes on in her teaching on anicca to say, if we look at our own personality, we'll find that our bodies are impermanent, and our minds are also characterized by impermanence. This is true of the things that we see around us. Not one thing will last. So understanding impermanence is an aid to the understanding of the ultimate nature of things. And understanding impermanence is a key to understanding no self. Again, I see these as all the same. The teachings, all three characteristics are one. So the second of the three characteristics is dukkha. All assembled things are subject to distress and suffering. I remember, Tejo, I think when you came to teach at ASM, it was a good many years ago, and you said, and I never forgot it, there was a translation of dukkha that was apart from space. And I actually read that again somewhere recently, and I was like, that I really appreciate that understanding of dukkha. Again, we try to put language to these characteristics. So dukkha, unsatisfactoriness. Dukkha is a Pali word that literally means a wheel out of kilter. So you can sort of imagine that, what it would be like to ride in a wagon or even in a car with a wheel that's out of balance. Every time that flat edge of the wheel or unbalanced wheel hits the ground, you notice you're slightly jolted. So most often dukkha is translated as suffering. One old-fashioned definition is to suffer is to bear or to endure. All things endure, they bear their changes. Once a thing is in form, it clings to its form even as the form changes. This is suffering. So, suffering, one of the things I think about when I think about understanding dukkha, we did at ASM, we did several year study of Bruce Tift's teaching. The book title is Already Free, and Bruce Tift was one of Chogyam Trungpa's Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche's students. So Bruce Tift wrote this amazing book called Already Free, and in that he talks about the natural level of what we describe as anxiety that is part of being human. And I think that's also important. Again, in our culture, we're taught that this level of whatever you would like to call it, is actually a body sensation, that there's something sort of pathological about this. And I think one of the most important ways to understand anxiety is it's just a normal reaction to the world, to being human, that our bodies are really going to give us messages related to our safety in the world. And right now, I think we're getting lots of messages related to the world not feeling safe. So, in other words, it's again, Western culture has sold us this sort of belief that these emotions that we think of, like anxiety, that there's something, there's an illness. And I think it's useful to reframe that understanding, is that, you know, some of the unsatisfactoriness is, or that what we label, again, it's always fascinating to me too, that we put labels on body sensations, and those are what we know as emotions. And the good news is that we can relabel those. So dukkha, sometimes just a very normal human response. Unsatisfactoriness, a wheel out of kilter. Again, we're looking for words to describe an experience. Sujata goes on in her commentary, consider the perfect rose, its beauty, its form, color, fragrance. It's perfect now, today, yet already it's changing. It will rot. It will stink. It will droop. It will become drab brown. So she goes on to say, how about the fantasy of, I put fantasy in there, how about the perfect relationship? Right. Again, no such thing as happily ever after. Why can't we be satisfied with things? Is there something wrong with us? So she says, here's the answer to that question. Why can't we be satisfied with things? The world of form is not an end, it is a transition. It is where things come into and go out of formation. It is where forms are born and where they die. And here's another really crucial understanding. We are a transition too. We came into this form. We'll go out of this form at some point. We're impermanent. We're inconstant. If we're seeking a dependable basis for long-term happiness and ease, anything inconstant is obviously a stressful place to pin our hopes. Like trying to relax in an unstable chair whose leg is liable to break at any moment. So if you all have thoughts or questions, feel free to go, hey, otherwise I'm just going to continue to the third mark or characteristic of existence. But I'm perfectly fine with stopping to ask questions or clarify anything. Again, this is a huge, huge teaching. Huge. Yes.
Whatever Tejo, whatever you described dukkha, how did you describe dukkha that you were mentioning?
Apart from space.
Can you talk about that a little bit? Like why that is because I've never heard dukkha explained that way. I don't really understand that.
Yeah. Am I right, Tejo? I mean, I actually wrote that down because I think you were talking about it in a Dharma talk you did at ASM. And my understanding of it is this, is that space meaning emptiness, right? These teachings are basically trying to explain to us that all things are empty. And that's the teaching of the Heart Sutra and many, many, many other of the Buddhist teachings are all about emptiness, right? Like impermanence is emptiness. So Thich Nhat Hanh explained to us that impermanence is emptiness in terms of time, and non-self is emptiness in terms of space. So what does empty mean? Empty means actually empty of independent existence and full of everything. So the way I understood that about dukkha is that anything that is not part of that experience means that we're in form and we're suffering.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Good. I hope I got that right, Tejo. I don't know, or the way you intended it, because it was like it stuck with me. It definitely stuck with me. I actually wrote it down in this teaching. Okay, the last characteristic of existence, anatta. No self. Or egolessness. Again, Pema's term for this I really like. It doesn't create a clear category, self, no self. Okay, anatta is one of the really distinctive features of the teachings of the Buddha. Sometimes this teaching of no self is an occasion for confusion because we wonder, how can one deny the self? After all, we do say, I am speaking, or I am walking, or I am trying to offer the Dharma talk. I'm called so-and-so. This is my name. How can we deny the reality of that I? So in order to clarify this, it's important to remember that the rejection of I is not a rejection of this convenient designation I. It's a rejection of the idea that this name I stands for a substantial, permanent, and changeless reality. So again, we clearly have a self. We can't deny that we have a self, and we're not supposed to. In fact, when Thich Nhat Hanh retranslated the Heart Sutra, one of the things in his commentary that you can read, I think it's on the Plum Village website, one of the things that he said is he was retranslating the Heart Sutra because he thought the original translator had gotten it wrong, had not made it clear that we actually have a very real self that's right here, that we can't deny, or we're not trying to deny that we have a self. And he even offers one of those little Zen stories that has a Zen master speaking to a student, and he says, the ending of it is that the student says, yeah, I understand emptiness, and he gives the explanation that would suggest that that a lot of people actually use to sort of bypass, I think, that there really isn't a self. So the Zen master's response was to grab the student's nose and give it a little twist, to give him, to say, wait a minute, this is what you're missing. We can't just say there is no self here for me to inhabit and live in, and that's not what the teachings are trying to tell us, right? We're not trying to deny that we have an actual body and a self. We're trying to say that this is constantly changing container that we live in. So the Buddha has used the example of the chariot and the forest to explain the relation between the term I and the components of personal experience. The Buddha explains that the term chariot is simply a convenient name for a collection of parts that is assembled in a particular way. The wheels are not the chariot, neither is the axle, neither is the carriage. And in that way, you can see where she's going with this. It's like, so, put the self in there, right? The term self is a convenient name for a collection of parts that are assembled in this particular way to create the thing we call a human. Similarly, an individual tree is not a forest. Neither is a number of individual trees a forest. There is no forest apart from the individual trees. The term forest is just a convenient name for an assembly of individual trees. This is the thrust of the Buddha's rejection of the belief of a real, independent, permanent entity that is represented by the term I. Such a permanent entity would have to be independent, sovereign. It would have to be permanent, immutable, and impervious to change. And such a permanent entity, such a self, is nowhere to be found. So the Buddha has applied the following analysis to the body and mind to indicate that the self is nowhere to be found. Again, we sometimes stop right here and ask ourselves, okay, if you reflect on this, what is self? Stop just for a minute and say, okay, well, I'm saying self, but where is it? How can I actually define it? The body's not the self. If the body were the self would be impermanent and would be subject to change, decay, destruction, and death. So the body can't be the self. The self does not possess the body in the sense that I possess a cart, television, car, whatever, because the self cannot control the body. If the body falls ill, gets tired and old against our wishes, the body often takes a shape that does not agree with our wishes. So in no way does the self possess the body. And the self is not in the body. If we search our body from the top of our head to the tip of our toes, we can nowhere locate the self. Self isn't in your bones, not in the blood, not in the marrow, not in the hair. The self is nowhere to be found. And similarly, the mind is not the self. The mind is subject to constant change. Happy at one moment, unhappy at the next. So the mind cannot be the self, for the mind is constantly changing. And we're going through like this big, long sort of koan of what no self or egolessness means. But the self doesn't possess the mind because the mind becomes excited and depressed against our wishes. Although we know certain thoughts are wholesome and some are unwholesome, the mind pursues unwholesome thoughts. So the self doesn't possess the mind because the mind acts independently of the self. The self is not in the mind. No matter how carefully we search the contents of our mind, we can search our thoughts, our feelings, our ideas, and we can nowhere find the self. So again, we sometimes stop when we're in the middle of this teaching, or at the end of it, almost conclusion. There is a very simple exercise. We can all sit quietly just for a moment and look within our body and mind. And without exception, we will find that we cannot locate the self anywhere. So, the conclusion is that the self is just a convenient name for a collection of factors. There is no self, no essence, no core of personal experience apart from the ever-changing, interdependent, impermanent physical and mental factors of personal experience. There's some interesting research on this is also that comes to my mind that says that when we're in fully listening and in connection with another human, that even our thought processes become interconnected. Certainly, we know our bodies tune in that way as well. So. So why should we reject the idea of self? How can we benefit by rejecting the idea of self? So there are two important ways that we can benefit. First of all, in our everyday life, we can benefit in that we will become more creative, more comfortable, more open people. So that just echoes what Pema Chodron was saying, what Norman Fisher was saying. If we can just get this, we can be more creative, comfortable, open, maybe relaxed. As long as we cling to the self, we will always have to defend ourselves, to defend our possessions, property, prestige, opinions, even our words. But if we give up our belief in an independent, permanent self, we can relate to other people and situations without paranoia. We'll be able to relate freely, spontaneously, creatively. So understanding no self is like an aid to healthy living. Through the understanding of impermanence, suffering, and no self, we will have freed ourselves of the fundamental errors that imprison us within the cycle of birth and death. The error of seeing things as pleasant, the error of seeing things as self. When these delusions are removed, wisdom arises, just as when darkness is removed, wisdom arises. So again, we're to the that fourth characteristic. When wisdom arises, one experiences the peace and freedom of nirvana. And on our mala, when we conclude that particular teaching, when we recite these three characteristics, we go to the marker bead. And the marker bead is simply, in this way, I do most deeply vow to train the self. So that is the three characteristics of existence.
I just want to mention a couple things. One is that, I have my friend Shohaku Okamura talks about the four characteristics, and I think you alluded to that in a couple times, and you mentioned where it came from, and I don't know where it comes from, maybe Dogen. But the way that he frames it is, he says that dukkha, impermanence, interdependence, and nirvana are the four characteristics, as you mentioned, and that if we do not awaken to impermanence and no self or interdependence, that we suffer. And if we awaken, we're free. Nirvana, he translates as freedom.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's an interesting way to look at it. Like I said, I don't know where the fourth characteristic showed up, but I also, one of the other things I wanted to comment on is that the whole idea of no self, which I think for me, when I think of no self, it immediately puts me into the awareness that I don't exist by myself, which is what you were kind of talking about, but that feeling of connection with all of life. And there's so much, for me, just there's so much freedom in experiencing life in that way. So anyway, thank you very much. And I don't know what you want to say anything about what I said, but this was really helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. No, I would totally echo what you said, is that when you get to that place that you were describing, where everything else falls away and you recognize, you know, the interdependence of all things, that I think is freedom. That's what these teachings offer. This
Yes.
freedom. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're pretty much at 11 o'clock, so we probably should wind things up. So grateful to you for coming. And if anybody wants to check out the whole series, if you go to our website, greattreetemple.org, and go to archives, there's a drop-down menu with past teachings, past teachers, is that what it's called? And that will bring you to a page that has pictures on it. If you click on the pictures of the speaker, the speaker, but it's not the speakers, there's one that's just for these.
The word of the Buddha.
The word of the Buddha.
Oh, yeah.
We have one little icon, it's just for the word of the Buddha, so you can check out the whole series.
Nice. Wonderful. Good to know.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Excellent.
So next week,
Yeah, I'll give some announcements. So the speaker next Saturday is Meredith Mune McIntosh. And the title of her Dharma talk is Earth, Sky, Feet, Wings. She does a lot of like movement.
yeah, she's an
stuff.
Alexander technique teacher. I try to integrate body with mind in the practice. So
And then I guess I'll also preview at the end of March, all the way through about the middle of July, we have a pretty long practice period. That's the Keisei Ango practice period. So if you're interested in participating in that, you should email me at info@greattreetemple.org. And there's a few things, you know, there's certain study groups that you should participate in. There's the opportunity to participate in sesshin. So definitely reach out if you're interested in that practice period. It should be really, really interesting.
and it's the practice period that's leading up to the mountain seat ceremony. This is kind of a required practice period, so that's why it's a longer one. But please join if you can. And Genjo, Reverend Genjo will be doing a study of the book Mindful Politics, which is a group of essays by teachers such as the Dalai Lama, Thich Nhat Hanh, Katayiri Roshi, and I will be doing a study of Shohaku Okamura's commentaries on Menzan's commentary on Dogen's writing from the Bendowa on Jiju Zamai. If you want to know more, check in with me.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
And that's on Zoom or in person. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Wonderful.
May the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace.
Thank you so much, Starr. So
You're
much
welcome.
appreciated.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody.